Dad, you're obsolete now. The company is mine. The words cut deeper than any scalpel, and for a moment the steady beeping of the heart monitor beside me seemed to stop. My son, Lucas, stood at the edge of my hospital bed, his tie perfectly straight, his tone casual, as though he were merely discussing the weather. In that instant, 40 years of sweat and sacrifice collapsed into a single sentence. I wasn't his father anymore. I was just an obstacle in his way. How does a son come to see his father as disposable? And what happens to a man when the empire he built with his bare hands is stripped away with a signature? Before you continue, don't forget to subscribe and let me know in the comments where and when you're watching. The hospital gown clung to my skin, the fabric rough and cheap. A tray with a $12 serving of red Jell-O sat untouched on the side table. Through the half-closed blinds, I could see the Dallas skyline, the same towers I once hauled steel beams to raise when the company was just a truck and a dream. My body was weak, my chest still sore from the surgery, but my son's presence chilled me more than the sterile air of the room. Lucas set a leather folder on the tray table, sliding it toward me with the precision of a banker rather than the tenderness of a son. He didn't ask how I felt. He didn't mention my recovery. His hand went straight to the uncapped pen, its silver clip catching the light like a blade disguised in polished steel. My hands trembled as I looked down at the papers, the words blurring. 40 years of my life reduced to clauses and subclauses ready to be erased by a line of ink. I thought of Karen, my wife, gone just 3 years now. She used to tell me the company was like our second child, born from long nights, cheap coffee, and a stubborn belief that tomorrow would be better than today. I glanced at Lucas, his jaw tight, his eyes impatient. For him, this company was never a legacy. It was leverage. As I held the pen, my chest heavy with more than just stitches, I realized we were no longer standing on the same ground. We spoke different languages now. I talked of family, he talked of power. That moment in the hospital was not just about business. It was the first crack in the foundation of blood itself, the fracture that would send me on a path I never imagined, away from my own son and into a battle that would decide not just who owned the company, but who we were as a family. I was not born with wealth. My fortune was made in the sweltering summer of 1981, when Dallas smelled of asphalt and diesel, and all I owned was a beat-up Ford truck I bought secondhand for $2,300. The paint peeled off in strips, the radio crackled with static more than music, and the driver's seat had a tear that scratched the back of my leg. Still, that truck carried my hope, and maybe my pride, too. I told Karen, my wife back then only 28, "This will be our start." She smiled the way she always did, as if she could see the future when I barely saw tomorrow. That first year, I hauled everything, scrap metal, steel beams, sometimes furniture people couldn't fit in their cars. I remember delivering steel rods to a construction site near Maple Avenue, the foreman handing me $220 in cash, bills damp with sweat from his pocket. It wasn't much, but I clutched that money tighter than any trophy. Each dollar was proof that I wasn't chasing smoke. By 1990, Collins Transport had 3 trucks, all second-hand, parked behind our little office on Elm Street. Karen painted the sign herself, Collins Transport, Inc. The letters were uneven, but they shone like gold to me. Emily was still a little girl then, drawing horses in the dust by the garage, while Lucas watched from the porch, his arms crossed even at 12, as though judging how far I could push this dream. The company grew in fits and starts. Some years felt like climbing a mountain with bare hands, interest rates biting into our profits, gas prices jumping from $1.16 a gallon to $1.90 almost overnight, contracts slipping through because I didn't know the right handshake at the right country club. But slowly, stubbornly, The business took root. By 2001, we had 15 trucks on the road, each one painted the same navy blue with gold letters. I thought then that I had built something Lucas and Emily could inherit, something no one could take away. I look back now and wonder if that was my first mistake, thinking a company could bind a family as tightly as blood. Sometimes a business is a bridge. Sometimes it is a wedge. Karen warned me once, when Lucas was 22 and already sharper with numbers than with people. Don't let the company become his measure of you. I laughed then, chalking it up to her poetic worries. But maybe she saw what I couldn't. The office we moved into in Highland Park cost $5 million by 2008, with polished oak floors that smelled faintly of lemon oil and windows that framed the skyline like a painting. I remember pacing those halls late at night, the click of my shoes echoing off the marble, whispering to myself that it was all worth it. Every scar on my hands, every night Karen ate dinner alone while I chased another contract. It all led here. So when Lucas stood in that hospital room, folder in hand, voice so certain that I was obsolete, it wasn't just a son betraying a father. It was the collapse of a story I had told myself for 40 years. A story where hard work and sacrifice bought loyalty. A story where family was the safest harbor. I realized, as the pen trembled in my grip, that maybe I had built a castle too high and forgotten to check if the ground beneath was solid. There's a strange cruelty in watching your life's work be turned against you. It felt like seeing your reflection in broken glass. You recognize the face, but it's distorted, sharp, cutting. In that moment I became both builder and stranger, father and exile. And deep down, a quiet question clawed at me. Had I planted the seed of this betrayal myself? It is easy to look back now and call it a family drama, the kind people whisper about or post as Reddit stories when greed tangles with blood. But when you are inside it, living each word, each look from your own son, it is not drama. It is thunder in your chest, a storm you cannot stop, and the sound of a legacy cracking under its own weight. The Highland Park mansion always seemed too large after Karen died. 32 rooms, polished oak floors, chandeliers that caught the morning light. Yet without her, it echoed like a cathedral where the choir had gone silent. I used to come down the staircase and half expect to hear her humming in the kitchen. Instead, there was only the hum of the refrigerator, a lonely machine filling the air with what felt like counterfeit life. Karen had been the center that held us together. She died 3 years ago, a quiet September evening, her heart finally surrendering after decades of carrying burdens for everyone else. I remember the cost of the funeral service at St. Mark's Church, $1,400 in total, a bill I signed with hands that shook not from money, but from the realization that no check could ever buy her back. Lucas wore his black suit like armor that day, shaking hands with board members, whispering to investors who came to pay their respects. Emily, by contrast, clung to me in tears, her voice breaking as she read a poem her mother once loved. Even then, I could see the division forming. One child grieving, the other calculating. After Karen's death, the mansion became Lucas's stage. He brought associates there, men like Victor Hale, who drove up in German sedans and spoke in clipped sentences about new directions and capital growth. I watched from the balcony one evening as Lucas poured them glasses of Macallan 18, the amber liquid catching the chandelier light like molten gold. He never noticed me standing in the dark. Or perhaps he didn't care. The company's headquarters mirrored the mansion's opulence. The $5 million office tower in downtown Dallas, with its glass lobby and marble reception desk, was once my pride. Every corner spoke of triumph. The boardroom with its 12 leather chairs, The framed contracts from major clients, the brass plaque engraved with Collins Transport Inc. But pride has a way of souring when it begins to serve as someone else's weapon. One afternoon, I overheard Lucas in that very boardroom, his voice low but sharp. "Dad doesn't understand how the world works anymore. He built this in the 80s. Different time, different rules. It's our turn now." The words weren't meant for me, but they found me anyway, drifting through the half-open door like smoke from a hidden fire. I thought then of Karen's warning years earlier, the way she pressed her hand on mine and whispered, "Don't let the company become the only language you speak with him." She must have sensed this fracture long before I did. Maybe she understood that money could tie people together just tightly enough to strangle them. Every evening, I sat alone in the mansion, staring at the empty chair across from me at dinner, and wondered if legacy was a gift or a curse. The chandeliers glowed overhead, but I felt as if I were dining in a cave. Lucas rarely joined me. He was always with clients or closing deals. Emily would call sometimes, her voice gentle. "Dad, are you eating okay?" But she lived in Austin with her husband and 2 kids, her life moving in rhythms that kept her far from the storm brewing here. The house was full, yet empty. The office gleamed, yet felt hostile. And my son, my own blood, was growing distant, his ambitions louder than the bond that once tied us. It is a strange thing when family begins to feel like strangers inside your own walls. It is even stranger when you realize that the battleground of betrayal has been prepared not by outsiders, but within the very empire you built. And so the cracks widened, in marble floors and dinner tables, in boardrooms and bedrooms. A mansion in Highland Park worth $12 million, a company valued at $25 million. Yet all I could feel was the absence of Karen, the silence where her voice should have been, and the slow, deliberate steps of a son moving closer to deceit. It happened 3 weeks after I was discharged from the hospital. My body was still weak, the stitches across my chest itching every time I moved, when Lucas arrived at the Highland Park mansion with Victor Hale in tow. Hale was the kind of man who wore wealth like a mask. Tailored suit, polished shoes, but eyes that never quite met yours. He carried himself as though every room belonged to him the moment he stepped in. Lucas set a leather folder on the dining table, the same table where Karen used to place Sunday roasts and birthday cakes. Now it was covered with contracts, not plates. "Dad," he said, his tone carefully measured, "this is just a formality. We need to restructure Collins Transport for growth. You'll still have your place, but we need your signature." His words slid across the polished oak like oil, smooth but leaving a stain. I reached for the folder, my hand trembling, not from fear, but from the weakness that still clung to me. The papers smelled faintly of ink and new leather, and I could see my name already printed in block letters. My eyes blurred, but one line stood out like a wound. Transfer of controlling shares. It was not a restructuring. It was a surrender. Victor Hale leaned forward, his cologne sharp, his voice almost whispering. "Mr. Collins, it's the smart move. At 70, you deserve rest. Let Lucas carry the load." He slid a Mont Blanc pen across the table. The silver clip caught the chandelier light like a thin blade, waiting for me to bleed my legacy onto the paper. I looked at my son. His jaw was tight, his hands steady, no trace of hesitation. He had already chosen his side, and it was not mine. "Lucas," I said quietly, "why now? Why press this when you know I can barely stand without pain?" He did not flinch. "Because waiting means losing opportunities. Dad, the world doesn't slow down for you." The words struck harder than any scalpel ever had. Was I no longer a father in his eyes, only an obstacle blocking his ambition? My chest tightened, not from the healing wound, but from the weight of betrayal. I thought of Karen, of the nights she urged me to trust the children, to believe legacy would keep us whole. How cruel it felt, in that moment, to realize the house we built together had become a stage for deceit, a performance where a son and his ally played their roles while I was cast as the relic to be removed. The papers sat between us, silent but heavy, like a gravestone waiting to be carved. My pen hovered, my hand unsteady, and for a fleeting second I asked myself, was this the price of 40 years? That I would sign away my life's work under my own roof, in the presence of my son, and call it family? I did not sign that night. But the seed was planted. Lucas had made his move, and I knew he would not stop until he got what he wanted. The war inside my own bloodline had begun, and there was no turning back. The story still has many unexpected twists. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss them. They told me my office was no longer mine on a Tuesday morning. Tuesdays are supposed to be forgettable days, the kind that slip between Monday's wait and Wednesday's hope. But that Tuesday, Lucas stood in the marble lobby of Collins Transport, flanked by 2 security guards who looked at me the way a maitre d' looks at a diner without a reservation. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Dad, you can't be here anymore. It's time for a clean break." I almost laughed then, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity was so sharp it bordered on comedy. A clean break. As though he were cutting off an old friendship instead of exiling his father from the empire he had built. One of the guards, a young man with a buzz cut, gestured politely toward the exit, like I was a guest who had overstayed his welcome. It reminded me of a hotel clerk tapping his watch, while the bellboy carried my bags. Except in this hotel, the bill came to $25 million. I walked out with nothing but a briefcase, a leather one Karen had given me in 1985, the edges worn soft from years of contracts and handshakes. My car, an old Buick that smelled faintly of cigar smoke, was waiting in the lot. No driver, no corporate license plate anymore. Just me, a 70-year-old man sitting behind the wheel of a car that suddenly felt too big for one person. That night, I signed a lease on a 1-bedroom apartment off Greenville Avenue for $200 a month. The carpet smelled of bleach, the refrigerator hummed louder than the traffic outside, and the walls were painted a color I can only describe as forgotten beige. The landlord shook my hand, eyes flicking to the credit check, probably wondering what a man with my name was doing in a place like this. I didn't bother explaining. I unpacked slowly. 3 suits, a box of family photographs, Karen's old recipe book, and the briefcase that once carried the fate of million-dollar deals. I set her recipe book on the counter, though the oven looked like it hadn't been used since Reagan was president. The first night, I sat on the sagging couch, eating microwaved soup from a plastic bowl, staring at a flickering light fixture overhead. It buzzed like an insect trapped in glass, a fitting soundtrack for a man who had been swatted from his own home. And yet, even in that dim light, the bitterness carried its own strange humor. 40 years of building a company, only to end up with a fridge full of store-brand soda and a rent receipt pinned to a cork board. It felt almost poetic, like the punchline to a cruel joke. But beneath that dark laughter was a heaviness I couldn't shake. Had I raised Lucas into this, shaped him into the kind of man who saw power as inheritance and family as a ladder to climb? Or was it something darker, an inevitability, a rot that had always been there, waiting for its moment? Lying in bed that night, the hum of the air conditioner filling the silence, I asked myself the kind of question people write about in revenge stories. The kind whispered in quiet bars or posted in late-night confessions. Do you fight back when your own blood betrays you, or do you wither quietly, letting history forget you? The shadows on the ceiling didn't answer. They only reminded me of the chandeliers back in Highland Park, glittering in a house where my son now poured whiskey for men who called me obsolete. I closed my eyes, but sleep did not come. Exile has a way of keeping you awake, reminding you with every creak of the walls that you are no longer who you once were. And as the hours passed, a thought began to grow inside me, fragile but insistent. If Lucas believed he had taken everything from me, perhaps he had forgotten one thing. I was still alive. The apartment smelled of bleach and loneliness, but that night my mind drifted far from its thin walls. I sat at the small kitchen table, a flimsy piece of plywood with plastic legs, and I thought of another table, one Karen and I bought in 1983. It was an old oak piece from a second-hand shop off Main Street, scratched and wobbling, but she ran her hand across it as if it were marble. "This table will hold our future dinners," she said with a smile that disarmed me every time. We paid $140 for it, a fortune back then when gas was 86 cents a gallon and I was still hauling steel beams in that Ford truck. That table stood in our first house for decades, weathering crayons from Emily, coffee stains from Lucas, and the elbows of tired nights when Karen and I mapped out what Collins Transport could become. When we landed our first big contract in 1987, $750,000 to deliver construction materials to a new hotel downtown. We ate takeout fried chicken at that table, champagne in paper cups, grease mixing with the bubbles. She laughed, grease on her cheek, and I thought then, this is what victory looks like. Not marble offices or golden plaques, but grease and champagne on a battered table with the woman who believed before anyone else did. The memory of that night hurt more than the stitches in my chest. I could almost hear her voice saying, "Don't forget where it began, Richard. Don't let the shine blind you." She warned me, in her quiet way, that success can seduce you into thinking it's permanent. And here I was, sitting at a rental table in a $1,200 apartment, wondering if I had ignored her wisdom so completely that I had delivered myself into exile. I looked at the single photo I had brought with me. Karen holding a pie she baked in 1992, the crust burnt at the edges, her smile unapologetic. The edges of the picture were frayed, but the warmth in her eyes was untouched by time. She was the gravity that kept the house from floating apart, the balance between Emily's softness and Lucas's hard edge. Without her, the cracks widened until the house itself seemed to collapse. A man can survive betrayal, but he cannot survive forgetting why he started. And that night, I realized Karen was still holding me to that truth. Every time I touched the photo frame, it was as if she were asking, "Is this who you wanted to be? A man undone by his own son? Or a man who remembers the table, the chicken, the champagne, and fights to honor it?" The apartment lights flickered, and I almost laughed at the irony. 40 years of building, and now the hum of a broken bulb kept me company. Perhaps that is the cruel beauty of a family drama, that it strips you bare until you either collapse under the weight or remember the oak beneath the scratches, the woman's hand on your shoulder, and find a reason to stand again. Lucas didn't bother dressing his words in courtesy the next time we met. It was in the boardroom I had chosen the wood for myself, cherry oak polished to a shine so deep you could see your reflection if you leaned close enough. He didn't even sit down. He stood at the head of the table as though the crown had already been placed on his head. His voice cut through the air, flat and merciless. "I deserve this money, Dad. You're just the past." The sentence landed heavier than the marble table, heavier than the 40 years that had led us there. For a second, I almost expected one of the board members to cough politely, to remind him he was speaking to his father. Instead, they shuffled their papers, suddenly fascinated by their pens. Silence, I've learned, is sometimes the loudest vote in the room. I leaned back, staring at the son I once carried on my shoulders at the county fair, the same boy who used to beg me for an extra $1 to play ring toss. Now here he was, speaking to me like a CEO cutting loose a redundant employee. There was a dark humor in it. What was I, if not redundant in his eyes? A man pushed aside by his own blood, like an outdated machine someone was too polite to throw away but too eager to stop using. "Lucas," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Money isn't the measure of worth. You'll learn that." He smirked, adjusting his cufflinks with the precision of someone savoring the theater of disrespect. "No, Dad," he said. "You'll learn that money is the only measure." Victor Hale, sitting near the end of the table, gave the faintest nod, as though approving the performance of a student he had trained. His rings clicked softly against his glass, a sound that grated more than it should have. That click echoed like applause for a play I hadn't wanted to attend. Inside, I burned. But there was a strange edge of bitter laughter, too. The kind of laugh you hear in Reddit stories where betrayal is so sharp it becomes absurd. A father called Obsolete by the very son who once cried when I missed a Little League game. Was this what all my nights on the road had bought me? Not gratitude, not loyalty, but a verdict. Past tense. I gathered my papers, each movement deliberate, my hands older but not yet broken. As I stood, the boardroom lights glared overhead, sterile and unforgiving. The glass walls reflected us both. Him standing tall in his tailored suit, me with shoulders bent but eyes still holding fire. And I thought to myself, if I am the past, then let the past remind the future of what it cost to get here. I walked out without looking back, but my heart carried the weight of his words. Perhaps I was the past, but the past, when cornered, has a way of writing its own ending. And this story, my story, was far from finished. That night in the small apartment, the silence pressed down heavier than the air itself. I sat at the kitchen counter with Karen's recipe book still unopened beside me, staring at the stack of documents Lucas had forced into my hands. My eyes lingered on the signature line. My name, printed in block letters, waiting to be erased by a counterfeit flourish. Was this what 40 years had come to? Just a forged signature, neat and soulless, reducing my life's work to a piece of paper soaked in ink? The thought gnawed at me, circling again and again. 40 years of loading trucks in the Texas heat, of chasing clients who promised payment and sometimes disappeared, of eating cold sandwiches on highways when money was too tight for diners, and all of it undone with a flourish of deceit. It was a kind of cruelty I could not explain to anyone. Even Emily, with her soft voice and tender calls, could not understand the way betrayal from your own blood hollows a man differently than loss or failure ever could. I poured myself a glass of cheap bourbon from the corner store. 14 tons 9.99 a bottle, the kind of drink I would never have touched in the Highland Park mansion. The liquid burned as it went down, but it was a familiar burn, almost comforting. The irony was not lost on me. 40 years of success, yet here I was choking down bargain liquor in a rented apartment, as though my life had circled back to the very beginning. And still the question wouldn't leave. Was Lucas always this way? Or did I shape him, brick by brick, with my own hands? I remembered him as a boy, standing in the driveway, watching me polish the trucks. His eyes had always been calculating, weighing things, tallying numbers. Maybe I mistook that hunger for ambition, when in truth it was something darker. An emptiness that no inheritance could ever fill. I thought of Karen then, and the oak table. What would she have said if she had lived to see this? Perhaps she would have told me to forgive, to see through the anger to the fear underneath. But I could not find forgiveness in me, not yet. All I could find was the bitter taste of a man cast aside by the very child he raised, a story so painfully absurd it could have been pulled from the archives of revenge stories, where fathers and sons trade love for money and end up with nothing but ashes. The bourbon glass sat empty on the counter, and I let it sit there, a monument to my fall. Outside, the city hummed with life, Sirens in the distance, laughter spilling from a nearby bar. The world moved forward as if my collapse were nothing more than a whisper. And maybe it was. But inside me, a voice began to rise, quiet but steady. If my son thinks he has already buried me with a forged signature, then he has forgotten one thing. The dead do not ask questions, the living do, and I intend to ask every one of them. The story is slowly revealing its deepest secrets. Subscribe now to follow it all the way. Mason Reed had the kind of office that smelled of old leather and quiet victories. The shelves behind him sagged under the weight of law books, whose spines had faded to the same dull brown, and the blinds were half drawn, letting in just enough light to remind you there was still a world outside. He leaned over the contract Lucas had shoved at me weeks earlier, his glasses sliding down his nose as he traced the lines with a deliberate finger. He didn't speak at first. Mason never rushed words. He let silence stretch until it became its own kind of punctuation. Finally, he looked up, his voice calm, but with the faintest edge of disbelief. "Richard, this isn't your signature." I almost laughed, though not from joy. "Of course it's my signature, Mason. That's the point. Lucas made sure of it." My attempt at humor fell flat, the kind of dark laugh you force when you realize the joke's been written at your expense. Mason shook his head slowly. "No, I mean it's not your signature. Not legally. This was forged, and not clumsily either. They used replication software, high-resolution capture. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." For a moment I just stared at him, the words not quite fitting into my mind. The idea that technology could steal not only my company but my very name felt almost biblical, as though I'd been erased by a machine. "So, what you're telling me," I said, voice dry, "is that my son hired someone to Photoshop me out of my own life." The corner of Mason's mouth twitched. "Crude way to put it, but yes, this is fraud. If we can prove it, Lucas is standing on a floor that's about to collapse." I leaned back in the chair, the leather creaking, my chest heavy with something that was not quite relief, not quite rage. It was hope, though hope can sometimes feel cruel when it arrives late. "All these years," I whispered, "and my downfall came not from competitors, not from the economy, but from a forged line of ink." Mason tapped the paper with his pen. "Richard, you may have lost the boardroom, the house, the company cars, but this could bring it all back. Lucas and his friend Hale, they crossed into criminal territory. That's not business, that's deceit." The word hung in the air, sharp and unforgiving. Deceit. My son's betrayal had always felt personal, but now it was written in legal ink, a crime that no board member could politely ignore. I felt a bitter smile spread across my face, a smile I didn't entirely trust. "Well," I said softly, "I suppose every empire eventually leaves a paper trail. Maybe this time the trail leads back home." For the first time in weeks, the walls around me didn't feel like a cell. The apartment, the bourbon, the flickering lights, none of it mattered in that moment. What mattered was that the fight wasn't over. Lucas thought he had buried me with a pen stroke, but he had forgotten something vital. Dead men don't hire lawyers. It was Mason who suggested I speak to old contacts inside the company. "Paper trails don't vanish, Richard," he said. "They only change hands." A week later, I received a call from an unfamiliar number, the kind you stare at for a moment before deciding whether to answer. The voice on the other end was hesitant, almost whispering. "Mr. Collins, this is Daniel. I used to manage accounts receivable for Collins Transport." I remembered him then. Quiet, diligent, the kind of employee who stayed late balancing books while the world outside went home. He asked to meet somewhere private, so we chose a diner off Interstate 35, a place where the coffee cost $2.50 and the waitress had been refilling the same pot since sunrise. Daniel slid into the booth across from me, his shoulders hunched as if he expected someone to follow him. He didn't bother with small talk. He pulled a manila folder from his bag, the edges worn soft. Inside were photocopies of wire transfers, numbers I hadn't seen before. "These started after you left," he said, his finger tracing the lines. "Large sums, 500,000 here, 1.2 million there, wired to accounts in the Cayman Islands, Belize, even Zurich. It's not reinvestment, it's extraction." The papers smelled faintly of toner, but what they carried was the stench of rot. Offshore accounts. My son wasn't just replacing me. He was gutting the company from the inside out. I stared at the numbers until they blurred, my chest tightening not from age or weakness, but from a rage that came laced with disbelief. "He's stealing from his own inheritance," I muttered, half to myself. Daniel's eyes darted to the window. "Mr. Collins, he doesn't see it that way. To him, the company is a vault, and you were the lock. Now that you're gone, he's emptying it." I leaned back, the cracked vinyl booth groaning under my weight, and let out a bitter laugh. 40 years of hauling steel and fuel, and my son reduces it all to an ATM. It was the kind of dark irony you'd expect in Reddit stories, where family betrayal reads like fiction until you're the one living it. Daniel slid the folder closer. "I shouldn't be showing you this, but I couldn't keep watching. He's reckless, and if the feds catch wind..." His voice trailed off, heavy with implication. I placed my hand on the folder, feeling the weight of more than paper. This was no longer about a forged signature. This was about an empire bleeding in secret, each transfer a knife in the back of the company I built. When Daniel left, I stayed at the booth long after the coffee had gone cold. Outside, trucks rumbled down the freeway, carrying goods for men who still believed in honest work. I thought of my own trucks, painted navy blue with gold letters, and wondered how many more would carry not cargo, but the stench of my son's betrayal. The folder sat beside me, quiet and damning, and for the first time I felt the shape of the war ahead. Lucas thought he had buried me, but the paper trail said otherwise. And the trail, if followed, would lead not just to him, but to the shadows he had invited into our family's name. Mason never liked theatrics, but that afternoon in his office, he abandoned the quiet restraint of a lawyer and cut straight to the bone. Lucas had agreed to meet, though not without Victor Hale hovering in the corner like a shadow dressed in a $1,000 suit. Mason set the folder of transfers on the desk with a heavy slap, the kind that made even the blinds rattle. He didn't waste time. "Do you really think you can outsmart an entire legal system, Lucas? Do you believe federal auditors and fraud investigators are just props for your little performance?" Lucas leaned back in his chair, unbuttoning his jacket with the ease of a man auditioning for a role he thought he'd already secured. "The law is just paperwork, Mason. Paperwork can be bent, shredded, rewritten. My father built a company by playing fair. I'll expand it by playing smart." He smirked, as if the two words meant the same thing. I sat silently at the side, my fists pressed against my knees, the urge to shout held back only by the weight of years between us. Mason pressed on, his tone sharper. "Smart? You're funneling millions into offshore accounts like a college kid hiding beer money from his parents. You think Zurich and the Caymans won't talk when subpoenas land? This isn't strategy. This is fraud." Lucas tilted his head, studying Mason like one might study a painting, amused by the critic's outrage. "Fraud is what you call it. I call it leverage. The old model is dead, Mason. Dad clung to it like a relic, but times have changed. Global markets, digital transfers, new rules. If I wait for permission, I'll end up just like him. Obsolete." The words stung more than any court summons ever could. Obsolete. He said it without hesitation, as though reducing me to a cautionary tale was part of his business plan. Victor Hale chuckled softly in the corner, the sound like a man enjoying a cigar after a good meal. Mason didn't laugh. He leaned forward, his glasses catching the desk lamp. Lucas, men who talk like you end up in prison. Men who think ambition makes them bulletproof usually find out the hard way that bars aren't made of paperwork. For the briefest moment, I thought I saw something flicker across my son's face, defiance tinged with the faintest sliver of doubt. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a cold smile. "Let the law come," he said. "I've already built escape routes." The room fell silent. I could hear the faint tick of Mason's clock, each second hammering the truth deeper. My son wasn't merely misguided. He wasn't playing at business. He had chosen this path deliberately, stripping away family and legacy for the sake of power. There was a strange comedy in it, 40 years of building. And now I was watching my son audition for a villain's role in a story that had once been about us. The kind of dark tale you read late at night, half believing it's fiction until it's your own name on the page. A revenge story, only this time the revenge wasn't mine. It was his, against the very father who had given him everything. When the meeting ended, Lucas walked out first, his shoes clicking confidently across the floor. Hale followed, the scent of expensive cologne trailing behind him. Mason and I sat in silence, the folder of evidence still open between us. The law would have its say eventually, but in that moment I understood. The fight ahead wasn't only about signatures and wire transfers. It was about whether blood meant anything at all once money had entered the room. The first sign that the storm had reached Washington came in the form of a knock at Mason's office door. It wasn't a client, nor one of his paralegals, but a woman in a dark blazer who introduced herself with quiet authority. Agent Sarah Martinez, Federal Bureau of Investigation. She carried a briefcase and a badge, the kind of combination that can make even the most confident man suddenly sit straighter. She didn't waste time. On Mason's desk, she laid out a stack of documents far thicker than Daniel's folder. Bank statements, offshore transfers, internal memos, each one a thread, together weaving a net. Her voice was steady, clinical, as though she had delivered this speech countless times. Mr. Collins, your company has been used to launder approximately $25 million over the last 18 months. The primary architect of these operations appears to be a man named Victor Hale. Hearing Hale's name spoken aloud by the FBI carried a strange satisfaction, though it was laced with dread. For weeks, I had felt like a madman whispering betrayal into the void, a father crying wolf in his own house. But here it was, confirmation stamped with a federal seal. Lucas hadn't merely betrayed me, he had hitched himself to a criminal enterprise, dragging our family's name into the mud. Agent Martinez looked directly at me, her eyes sharp, but not unkind. Your son is complicit, whether knowingly or through negligence. The transfers bear his authorization codes. The words felt like a knife, precise, necessary, but cutting straight through bone. I wanted to protest, to insist Lucas had been manipulated, but the papers on the desk screamed louder than my denial ever could. Mason leaned back, his arms crossed. So it wasn't just reckless bookkeeping. It was deliberate. Martinez nodded. Hale has a history, securities fraud, shell companies, connections in Panama. He's been under our radar for years, but attaching himself to Collins Transport gave him legitimacy. The size of your company, its clean reputation, it was the perfect front. The irony twisted in my gut. 40 years of building trust with clients, shaking hands until my knuckles ached, keeping every promise, even when it cost me. And now that trust had been weaponized, turned into a laundering machine. My name had become Hale's camouflage. I tried to find humor in it, the bitter kind that makes people on the outside smirk while you choke on it. So I wasn't just retired early, I said. I was promoted to unwitting accomplice in a federal crime. That'll look great on my obituary. Mason shot me a glance, but even he couldn't hide the corner of his mouth twitching. Sometimes dark irony is the only rope left to cling to. Martinez didn't laugh. She tapped the papers. We're preparing subpoenas. Once this breaks open, there will be arrests. You should prepare yourself, Mr. Collins. What comes next won't be easy. This isn't just a corporate dispute. It's organized fraud, and it's going to get messy. I stared at Hale's name on the documents, ink sharp and permanent. And for a long moment, all I could think of was Karen. What would she have said, knowing the empire she watched me build had been hollowed out into a vault for criminals? Perhaps she would have called it the cruelest form of family drama. A husband's legacy hijacked, a son seduced by greed, a stranger pulling strings behind velvet curtains. As Martinez packed her case, her parting words hung in the air. The past may be behind you, Mr. Collins, but your story with Collins Transport isn't over yet. Not by a long shot. And for the first time, I believed her. The most dramatic part is still ahead. Don't forget to hit subscribe and join me to the very end. The day it all came crashing down did not arrive quietly. It was a Wednesday morning when the lobby of Collins Transport, polished marble and glass that once felt like my triumph, became the stage for my son's undoing. I had walked those halls for decades, but that morning I wasn't alone. Agent Sarah Martinez and 3 FBI officers swept past the receptionist with the kind of authority that made even the coffee machine stop humming. Lucas was in the boardroom, mid-sentence with a group of investors, when the doors opened. The timing was almost poetic. Behind him hung the brass plaque I had once unveiled with pride. Collins Transport, Inc. The letters gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and for a fleeting second I thought, perhaps cruelly, that it looked more like a headstone now than a legacy. Lucas Collins, Martinez said firmly, her badge raised like a verdict. You are under arrest for wire fraud, securities violations, and conspiracy to launder funds through offshore accounts. The words fell like hammer strikes. The investors froze, eyes darting between Lucas and the agents. Lucas laughed. Actually laughed. It was short, sharp, and dripping with the kind of arrogance that made my stomach turn. This is a mistake, he said, adjusting his tie. I'm in the middle of a deal. He turned to the investors, as if the interruption were nothing more than a fire drill. Gentlemen, you know how bureaucracy loves its theatrics. But the cuffs snapped cold around his wrists, the metallic click echoing in the silent boardroom. I had heard that sound before, years ago, when we delivered shipments to correctional facilities. The clink of metal that announces freedom has just been repossessed. The irony wasn't lost on me. My son, who once mocked me as obsolete, was now reduced to the sound of a chain closing. Victor Hale was nowhere to be seen, the ghost who had engineered so much of this vanishing at the first whiff of federal air. Typical. Hale never played roles that ended with handcuffs. He let others take the stage for that finale. Lucas turned to me as the agents guided him toward the door. His eyes weren't pleading. They were burning. Furious, as if my very existence had summoned this reckoning. You did this, he hissed, his voice low but sharp enough to slice through the silence. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't have words, but because the truth was standing behind him in uniform, dragging him past the brass plaque that bore our name. What words could compete with that sight? The investors shuffled awkwardly, some already gathering their briefcases, their eyes calculating whether association with the Collins name was now a liability. A dark thought struck me then, one that almost made me laugh out loud. 40 years of building credibility, and in 5 minutes my son had transformed it into the sort of scandal people whisper about in hushed tones or read like twisted chapters from revenge stories. As Lucas disappeared into the hallway, the door swinging shut behind him, I felt no triumph, only an emptiness, heavy and strange. The company was not restored to me. Not yet. The mansion in Highland Park remained lost, and the years with Karen could never return. But the sound of those handcuffs, sharp, final, undeniable, echoed inside me like the toll of a bell. And for the first time in months, I knew the reckoning had only begun. The courthouse smelled faintly of polish and dust, as though it was trying too hard to disguise its age. I sat in the front row beside Mason, my hands folded tightly in my lap, waiting for the verdict that would decide whether 40 years of work had truly been erased, or if there was still some justice left in this country. Across the aisle sat Lucas, pale and restless in a navy suit that hung awkwardly now that his confidence had been stripped away. Victor Hale was absent, of course. Men like Hale never linger when the light gets too bright. When the judge spoke, his words rolled through the room with the weight of finality. The contract transferring ownership of Collins Transport, Inc. is hereby declared null and void. Evidence shows the signature of Mr. Richard Collins was forged, and therefore holds no legal standing. The gavel struck once, and in that moment the air seemed to loosen in my lungs. The company I had built from a battered truck and an oak table was no longer a stolen prize. It was mine again. The judge didn't stop there. He shifted his gaze toward Lucas, who had gone rigid in his chair. Furthermore, Mr. Lucas Collins is remanded to custody pending trial for fraud, wire transfers in excess of $25 million, and conspiracy to launder funds through offshore accounts. The sound of the gavel echoed again, sharper this time, as though it were sealing more than just a legal decree. It was sealing my son's fate. Lucas tried to laugh, the same brittle laugh he'd used in the boardroom when the FBI first arrived. But it faltered. He muttered something under his breath, too low for the court to catch, though I saw his lips form the words, "You did this." Perhaps he believed it. Perhaps blaming me was easier than admitting the truth, that he had written his own downfall, line by line, wire by wire. As the bailiff guided him away in handcuffs, I felt no triumph, only the kind of emptiness that follows a long storm. Yes, I had regained the company, the assets, the house that stood silent in Highland Park. But the cost had been staggering. The fracture of blood, the collapse of trust, the death of a bond that had once seemed unbreakable. Mason leaned toward me, whispering, "Justice doesn't always feel like victory, Richard. Sometimes it just feels like less loss." His words landed heavy. They were right. This was not victory in the way people cheer at in revenge stories, with a clean cut and a cathartic ending. This was messier, grayer. A father standing in a courtroom, watching his son led away not by ambition, but by shackles, and realizing that sometimes winning looks an awful lot like losing. As I stepped out of the courthouse, the sun caught the city skyline, the same towers I had once hauled beams to build. They seemed colder now, more distant. Yet there was something undeniable in the air, too. A strange relief. The weight of injustice lifted just enough for me to breathe again. The fight had ended in law, but inside me, the echoes of family, betrayal, and blood still raged on. Emily was waiting outside the courtroom when they led Lucas away. She had held herself together through the proceedings, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles turned white, but the sight of her brother in handcuffs broke something in her. Tears welled and spilled as she whispered his name, not as an accusation, not even as a plea, but as if calling to the boy she once played tag with in the backyard. He didn't look back. Lucas kept his chin high, his jaw locked, eyes fixed straight ahead, as if acknowledging her would only deepen the wound. For a moment I thought I should reach out, comfort her, tell her that it wasn't her fault. But what words could hold when family fractures this deep? Emily turned to me, her face streaked with grief, and I saw in her eyes the question she didn't dare voice. Could I forgive him? Could I forgive the son who had tried to erase me with a forged signature, who had drained the company dry, who had stood in front of the world and called me obsolete? The answer, to my own surprise, was yes and no. Yes, because carrying hate is like carrying a hot coal. It burns you long before it hurts the one you aim it at. No, because forgiveness is not the same as absolution. Lucas had made his choices, and the consequences would carve their mark whether I wished it or not. In my heart, I released the anger, but I could not and would not erase the truth. As Emily cried softly beside me, I felt the absurdity of it all creep in, the kind of bitter humor life seems to save for its cruelest turns. Here we were, a family once bound by Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings, reduced to courthouse whispers and prison transport vans. The Collins legacy, polished into marble and brass, had unraveled into something closer to a cautionary tale. A chapter that could sit alongside the darkest family drama one could imagine, the kind people shake their heads at, grateful it isn't theirs. I rested my hand gently on Emily's shoulder, the way I once did when she was a little girl afraid of thunderstorms. "We'll be all right," I said quietly, though I wasn't entirely sure what all right meant anymore. Not a return to what we were, that was gone. Not even reconciliation with Lucas, that bridge had burned to ash. But perhaps all right could mean surviving, carrying Karen's memory, holding on to the pieces that hadn't shattered. Outside the courthouse, the sun was too bright, almost mocking, the kind of light that makes you squint as if the world itself refuses to let you look at it straight. Emily walked close beside me, still wiping her tears, and I thought, families are not destroyed in an instant. They crack, splinter, and only when the weight becomes unbearable do they break completely. And when they do, the sound is deafening. Yet beneath the silence that followed, I felt something subtle stir. A quiet strength, not from victory, but from surviving the collapse. And in that small, fragile space, I chose forgiveness, not for Lucas's sake, but for mine. The decision to sell Collins Transport was not made in a single moment, but rather over quiet weeks that followed the trial. I would walk the halls of the office, the marble floors echoing beneath my steps, and feel no triumph. The desks were polished, the contracts stacked neatly, the brass plaque still gleamed, but it no longer felt like mine. What once had been the beating heart of my life now felt like a mausoleum. Mason handled the paperwork with his usual calm precision, and when the deal closed, the wire transfer hit my account with an almost anticlimactic ping. 40 years, reduced to digits on a screen. I packed only what mattered. Karen's recipe book, the oak table, scuffed and uneven, but still standing, and a few photographs of Emily and Lucas from the years before ambition turned corrosive. Everything else, the cars, the office furniture, the polished boardroom, I left behind. Some legacies aren't worth carrying if the weight of them drags you under. The countryside in Texas welcomed me back with a kind of silence I had almost forgotten. The house I bought sat on 5 acres, modest but open to the sky, where cicadas hummed in the evenings, and the air smelled faintly of cedar and soil. I traded board meetings for mornings on the porch, sipping coffee as the sun edged over the horizon, and in that simple rhythm, I found a peace money had never given me. Emily visited often, bringing her children who ran barefoot through the grass, their laughter filling spaces in me I thought were gone forever. Sometimes at night, I would sit at the oak table, its scars glowing under the lamplight, and think of Karen. I imagined her there with me, flower on her cheek, her smile patient and knowing. And I would remember the courthouse, the handcuffs, the betrayal, The strange absurdity of a story that might read like one of those Reddit stories people devour online. Too cruel to be fiction, too familiar to be ignored. Yet for me, it was not a headline or a cautionary tale. It was my life. Now, in my 70th year, I understood something I never had in the decades of chasing contracts and profits. Success is not in numbers or titles. It is in survival, in love that outlasts loss, in forgiveness that frees the forgiver. I was no longer the owner of a $25 million company. I was a man who had learned the price of trust and the value of freedom. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. To hear the next story, click on the box to the left. Thank you for watching, and may health and happiness stay with you and your family. In the next video, we will explore not just the ruins of a family empire, but the hidden costs of ambition, the kind that no fortune can ever repay.